I want you to picture something first, before anything else, because this is the image I need you to carry through the whole story. A porch. A house I grew up being told I'd never be good enough to deserve anything. My father standing in the doorway in a robe at 10 in the morning, holding a folded notice with shaking hands. My mother behind him, still in last night's makeup, asking a question she already knew the answer to. And me, standing on the steps in a blazer that cost more than their mortgage payment used to, holding a manila folder with a deed inside it. My deed. My house. The one they were currently living in. "This is some kind of mistake," my father said. "It's not," I told him. "Check the name on the title transfer. It's been mine for 11 days. That's the moment I'm going to take you to by the end of this story. But to actually understand it, to understand why it felt less like revenge and more like gravity finally doing its job, you have to go back 15 years, to a dinner table, and the first time my mother stood up in front of our whole extended family and called me her biggest disappointment. My name is Becky. This is the story of how a family decided, when I was 9 years old, that I was the failure of the household, and how every single year after that, they were quietly, methodically wrong. I want to be precise about something, because precision matters here. I wasn't a bad kid. I wasn't lazy or cruel or careless. I struggled to read. That's the whole, unglamorous truth of where this began. Letters swam on the page for me in a way they apparently didn't for other kids, and nobody in my house. Not my mother, not my father, not a single teacher in 4 years of elementary school ever once asked why. Instead, they had a story ready-made. My older sister Paige read at a 3rd grade level by kindergarten. She got gold stars and library certificates, and a place of honor on the refrigerator. I got red pen marks and a permanent seat at the kitchen table after dinner, where my mother would sit across from me with a workbook and a sigh that told me, every single night, exactly how much of a burden I was. "Paige never needed this," she'd say, not even looking up. "I don't understand what's wrong with you." By 3rd grade, the label had calcified. I wasn't struggling with reading. I was not academic. By 5th grade, my father had started introducing me to his friends with a joke that always got a laugh. "This one's our wild card, we're still waiting to see what she's good for." Delivered with the easy cruelty of a man who'd never once considered that a 9-year-old standing right next to him could hear every word. My father, Frank, owned 11 rental units across 2 buildings on the east side of town. He was proud of being a landlord in the specific way men are proud of anything that lets them feel like they're in charge of other people's lives. I remember being 7 years old, riding along with him on a Saturday, watching him hand a single mother named Mrs. Alvarez an eviction notice for being 4 days late on rent, telling her, not unkindly exactly, just flatly, that business was business and feelings didn't pay mortgages. I remember her face. I remember asking my father in the car afterward if we could just let her have more time, and I remember him laughing. Not meanly, just genuinely amused, and saying, "That's exactly why you'll never be able to run anything, Becky. You think with your heart instead of your head." I was 7 years old, and my father had already decided what I'd never be capable of. My mother, Carol, ran the household like a stage production for an audience that was always one room over. Appearances were the family religion. The right car, the right country club guest pass, the right daughter, displayed at the right dinner parties, doing the right things. Paige was the production's leading lady. Straight A's, then law school ambitions, then an actual acceptance to a respectable university with a partial scholarship my parents bragged about for 2 solid years. I was the understudy nobody had bothered to give lines to. The cruelest part wasn't even the insults. It was the casualness of them. By the time I was 16, Becky's Our Little Failure project had become a genuine, repeated joke at family gatherings, said with a laugh, said like affection, the way you'd talk about a dog that chews furniture. And every single time, my sister Paige laughed loudest of anyone in the room. I want to be fair to her for one paragraph, because fairness matters in a true story. Paige didn't invent the label. She just never once, in 18 years, used her position to question it. She inherited a stage where she was the star, and she never asked why the spotlight only pointed one direction. By 17, I'd stopped trying to prove anything to either of them. I'd learned the trick every undiagnosed kid eventually learns. Memorize what you can, guess what you can't, smile through the parts you don't understand, and never, ever let anyone see exactly how much it costs you to function in a world built for people whose brains work differently than yours. I had no idea, at 17, that the thing actually wrong with the picture wasn't me. I also had no idea that my parents had already done something far worse to me than calling me a failure. Something with my name on legal paperwork I wouldn't discover for almost a decade. The night everything became official, the night the joke stopped being a joke and became a verdict, was the night of Paige's engagement party, the same week she turned 23. My parents had remortgaged a chunk of equity in the rental buildings to fund Paige's next chapter. A home staging and interior design boutique she wanted to open downtown. The kind of business that needed exactly the kind of capital injection a proud father loves writing checks for. The engagement party doubled, conveniently, as the launch announcement. My father stood at the head of a rented banquet table, glass raised, and gave a toast I can still recite word for word, because I've replayed it in my head more times than any memory has the right to be replayed. Paige has always known exactly who she is, he said, beaming at her like she was a trophy he'd personally polished. Some people are built for big things. Some people. He paused, and I felt the entire table's attention shift, slow and predatory, toward me. Some people take a little longer to find their lane. Maybe they never do. But hey, he laughed. We love you anyway, Becky. Every family needs a cautionary tale. The table laughed. My mother laughed. Paige, 23 years old, glowing in a $5,000 dress my parents had financed along with everything else, laughed loudest, head tipped back, hand on her fiancé's arm like this was simply the funniest, most harmless thing in the world. I sat there in a dress I'd bought myself, working 2 jobs to afford the gas money to even be in that room, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very still. Not heartbroken, past heartbroken. I'd been heartbroken about this family for so many years that the feeling had worn a groove and then worn through it entirely, into something colder and more permanent. I left before dessert. Nobody followed me to the parking lot. Nobody called the next day to check if I was all right. My mother texted me 3 days later, not to apologize, but to ask if I could stop being so sensitive about Dad's joke, because it was ruining the mood of an otherwise perfect week. That was the last family event I attended for 6 years. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't discover until I was 26 years old, sitting in a credit counselor's office with my hands shaking around a printout, was that my parents hadn't just humiliated me that night. They'd been quietly stealing from my future since I was 14 years old, and the bill for that theft was about to come due in a way none of us could have predicted. I moved out 3 weeks after the engagement party, into a studio apartment above a laundromat that I will love, in a strange way, for the rest of my life, because it was the first place that was entirely, unconditionally mine. Getting there should have been simple. It wasn't. The first apartment I applied for, a perfectly ordinary 1-bedroom, nothing fancy, well within what I could afford on my 2 part-time jobs. Rejected my application within a day, citing a credit score so low the leasing agent actually asked me, not unkindly, if I'd been a victim of identity theft, because the number didn't match the rest of my file. I laughed it off. I was 18. I assumed it was some clerical error, a glitch, a problem that would sort itself out. I didn't have the money or the knowledge to dispute anything, so I did what poor, exhausted 18-year-olds do. I found a landlord willing to take a higher deposit instead of a credit check, and I moved on with my life, filing the mystery away in the part of my brain reserved for problems I didn't have the bandwidth to solve yet. I worked. God, I worked. Mornings at a diner, evenings stocking shelves at a hardware store. A year of feeling like I was running just to stay in the same exact spot, while Paige's boutique launch made the local papers, 30 under 30 feature, and my mother posted about it on every platform she had access to. The thing about being told you're a failure for 18 straight years is that it doesn't just disappear the day you move out. It moves in with you. It sits in the passenger seat of every decision you make. I'd catch myself at 20, 21, 22, hesitating to apply for jobs that were genuinely within my reach, because some old, well-worn voice in the back of my head, My father's voice, my mother's voice, eventually just my own voice wearing their words, would tell me I'd only embarrass myself trying. It took a manager named Diane at the hardware store to crack that voice open for the first time. Diane noticed, over about 8 months, that I was unusually slow processing written inventory sheets, but unusually fast, faster than anyone else on staff, at catching pricing errors and pattern mismatches in the register numbers. One day, watching me squint and mouth words silently over a delivery manifest, she asked me gently if anyone had ever screened me for a reading disability. "I'm not stupid," I said, too fast, too defensive, the words coming out of some 14-year-old part of me that had been waiting a decade to say them out loud to someone who might actually listen. "I didn't say stupid," Diane said. "I said disability. Those aren't the same word, Becky." She wrote down the name of a community assessment center on a receipt and told me it was free and that I had nothing to lose by finding out. I sat on that receipt for 4 months before I called. The assessment took 2 sessions. At the end of the second one, a kind, tired-looking psychologist named Dr. Reyes, no relation, I'd later joke, to the man who'd changed my whole life a few years on, sat across from me with a folder and said the sentence that split my life cleanly into before and after. "You have moderate dyslexia, Becky. Likely also some dyscalculia, based on these scores. This isn't new. This has been with you your entire life, and based on what you've told me, nobody ever checked." I asked her, voice cracking in a way that embarrassed me, if that meant I wasn't actually stupid. She looked at me like the question itself had hurt her. "You are not stupid," she said. "You are someone who was never given the right tools, and then blamed for not succeeding without them. Those are very different things, and I think you've spent a very long time confusing the two." I cried in my car in that parking lot for 40 minutes. Not because the diagnosis was sad, because it was, in a strange and furious way, the first piece of good news I'd received about myself in my entire life. 18 years of failure collapsed, in one afternoon, into a much smaller, much more human truth. Nobody had ever bothered to look closely enough to see what I actually needed. I started using a screen reader for dense paperwork. I started recording lectures when I went back, slowly, to take night classes in business administration. And for the first time in my life, numbers, actual numbers, spreadsheets, financial statements, started making a different kind of sense to me, fast and intuitive in a way reading never had. It turned out the part of my brain that struggled with letters had been quietly excellent with patterns the entire time. Nobody had ever handed me a single document built for the way I actually thought. The moment someone did, something in me that had been clenched for 18 years finally unclenched. It was through one of those night classes that I met Walter Reyes, 61 years old, semi-retired, guest lecturing a section on distressed property valuation because, as he put it, somebody's got to tell these kids the textbook version isn't how it actually works. He noticed, the way good teachers notice things, that I asked the sharpest questions in the room, and then apologized for asking them. "Stop doing that," he told me after class one night. "You ask better questions than half the people I've hired in 30 years. Come work for me. I need someone who actually thinks instead of someone who just memorizes." I started, 3 weeks later, as an assistant property analyst at a small investment firm that specialized in something I'd never heard of before that first paycheck. Buying distressed mortgage debt at a discount, working it out where possible, recovering value where it wasn't. Walter taught me everything. How a note trades hands, how a bank decides a loan isn't worth servicing anymore, how an entire property's fate can change ownership in a single bulk transaction nobody involved even knows is happening until the new paperwork arrives. I was 23 years old, finally understanding, for the first time, exactly what kind of mind I actually had. I had no idea yet that the same skill set would, in 4 more years, hand me the exact tool I'd need to understand precisely how my parents had built their entire lifestyle. Partly on my back, without my knowledge, since I was 14 years old. I'm not going to pretend the next 4 years were a straight line, because nothing worth telling ever is. I made real mistakes. My first solo deal, a duplex Walter let me analyze and pitch to the firm's investment committee, looked perfect on paper and turned into an 8-month headache when a structural issue surfaced that I'd missed in my inspection notes. Walter didn't yell at me. He sat me down, walked through exactly where my analysis had gone wrong, and said the thing that stuck with me every single deal since. The lesson cost us $12,000. That's cheap for what you just learned. Don't waste it by being too proud to remember it. I built credit the slow, humiliating way. A secured card with a $500 limit, on-time payments tracked like scripture. 18 months before a real bank would even consider me for a business line. I made friends with exactly the kind of people I needed in my corner. Talia, a fierce, no-nonsense paralegal who became the best friend I'd never had growing up, the one who showed up with takeout on the nights the old voice in my head got loud again. And Marcus, a structural engineer Walter brought in to consult on a renovation project, who made me laugh the specific kind of laugh that surprises you with how long it's been since you used it, and who, 2 years into knowing each other, started showing up to my life the way no one in my biological family ever had, consistently, without conditions, without a joke at my expense waiting at the end of it. By 26, I'd saved enough, learned enough, and built enough credibility to register my own small fund. Ren Capital. 12 units, then 30, then a modest but real portfolio of distressed residential debt that Walter co-signed me into with a confidence I still don't think I've fully earned the right to feel about myself. Even now. It was during the due diligence process for my fund's official licensing, pulling my own full credit history going back over a decade, a routine compliance requirement, that I found the thread that unraveled everything I thought I understood about why my life had started so far behind everyone else's. 3 credit cards opened in my name, starting when I was 14 years old. Cards I had never applied for. Cards with a billing address that wasn't mine. It was my parents' house. Balances that had been run up over 4 years and then defaulted on, sometime around my 18th birthday. Right around the exact same month I'd been quietly, mysteriously denied that first apartment. I sat in Talia's office with that printout in my hands for a long time before either of us said anything. They opened credit in your name when you were a kid, she said finally, very carefully, the way you talk to someone standing near a cliff edge. Becky, that's not a parenting failure. That's a crime. I spent 3 weeks pulling every record I could legally access, mostly out of a need to understand, rather than any plan for what to do next. Talia helped me request the original account opening documentation from the 2 creditors who still had records on file that far back. What I found wasn't even particularly clever. It was just careless, in the specific way people are careless when they've never once imagined a consequence catching up to them. My social security number, my date of birth, an address that had always been theirs and never mine. 3 accounts opened across 4 years with statements mailed. I confirmed this later, going through old boxes at my apartment, to a P.O. box my father had kept and never once mentioned to me. The balances, once I cross-referenced the dates against my own memory, told their own quiet, devastating story. A $4,000 balance that lined up almost exactly with the semester page needed a deposit for a study abroad trip my parents had told extended family they were stretching to afford. A smaller, recurring balance tied to country club dues during the 2 years my father kept renewing a membership he complained, loudly and often, about not really being able to justify. They had used my name, my future, my eventual ability to rent an apartment or finance a car or build a life, to fund a lifestyle for the daughter they'd built their whole identity around, while telling that same daughter's sister, to her face for years, that she was the failure of the family. I want to tell you I confronted them immediately. I didn't. I sat with it for almost 2 months, mostly in silence, mostly at night, running the math over and over like if I checked it enough times it would eventually come out different. What I felt, in the end, wasn't even rage, not at first. It was something stranger and colder. A kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that an entire chapter of your life you'd blamed on your own inadequacy had actually been engineered by someone else's decisions, on purpose, for their own convenience. I made a decision in that silence that I still believe was the right one, even now. I wasn't going to sue them. The statute of limitations on most of it had likely already passed, Talia confirmed, and more than that, I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted something cleaner. I wanted, more than anything I had ever wanted in my life, to simply stop needing anything from them ever again. And then, if the universe happened to arrange the math in my favor down the line, I wasn't going to be the one to stop it. I had no idea, sitting in Talia's office that night, exactly how literally the universe was about to take me up on that. While I was building Ren Capital one painstaking deal at a time, the house I'd grown up in was slowly, quietly rotting from the inside, the way things do when the people running them have never once had to face a real consequence for a bad decision. Page's Boutique, the staging and design business my parents had remortgaged equity to fund, had a beautiful opening month and a brutal 18 months after it. Page, it turned out, was excellent at the part of running a business that involved being photographed in front of it, and catastrophic at the part that involved actually running it. Vendors went unpaid. A lease renewal got missed because nobody read the fine print on the auto-escalation clause. By the time Page was 28, the boutique had quietly rebranded twice, each rebrand funded by another round of bridge capital from my father, each round pulled from the same well. Equity in the rental properties and eventually equity in the family's primary residence itself, the house I'd grown up being told I'd never deserved to inherit. My mother kept the curtain up the entire time. Dinner parties continued. Vacation photos continued. A new car appeared in the driveway the same season. I'd later learn that my parents missed their first mortgage payment in 26 years of homeownership. I learned all of this the way you learn most family news once you've genuinely stepped outside the family's gravity. Secondhand, through Page's old high school friend, who was now, coincidentally, dating a guy on Talia's softball team. In the small, gossiping way small cities keep everyone tangentially connected whether they want to be or not. I didn't reach out. I want to be honest about that. I felt, hearing the news, a complicated knot of feelings I didn't love sitting with. A flicker of something almost like concern, buried under several much louder, much older feelings that had earned the right to be louder. I had no plan, at that point, to do anything with any of it. I was simply living my own life, building my own fund, 3 years removed from a family that had never once called to ask how I was doing. The universe, as it turned out, had other plans, and it routed them through a spreadsheet. Ren Capital's biggest acquisition to date came across my desk on an ordinary Tuesday in March. A bulk tranche of 41 distressed residential mortgage notes, being offloaded by a regional bank looking to clean its books before a quarterly audit. Standard stuff. I'd reviewed dozens of files just like it. I was 3 hours into due diligence, cross-referencing addresses against county records the way I did on every single deal, when an address stopped my hand on the mouse so completely that Talia, working at the desk across from mine, looked up and asked if I was okay before I'd even said a word. I read it 4 times. Same street. Same house number. The same chipped mailbox post I used to lean my bike against as a kid, visible in the satellite image pulled up next to the file. My parents' house was 41 files deep in a stack of anonymous distressed debt my company was about to buy for pennies on the dollar. I sat there for a long time with my hands flat on the desk, the way you do when you need your body to be very still while your mind catches up to something enormous. The note was 11 months delinquent. The original mortgage, a loan they'd taken out decades earlier, had been refinanced twice. Once for Page's initial boutique launch, once again 2 years later, for what the file listed, in the dry, clinical language of loan documentation, as business operations capital secondary. The math, once I ran it the way I'd run it for every other file in that stack, was unambiguous. Without a significant restructuring, this loan was headed to foreclosure within the year, with or without me. I had a choice in front of me that I genuinely didn't expect to ever have to make, and I sat with it for 3 full days before I told Walter or Talia or anyone else what I'd found. "You don't have to do anything with it," Walter told me, once I finally showed him the file, his voice careful in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "You could pull it from the bulk purchase entirely. Let someone else's fund pick it up. Nobody would ever know you saw it." "I know," I said. "So what do you want to do?" I looked at the file for a long moment. At the address, at the photo of the chipped mailbox post, at 11 months of missed payments belonging to 2 people who had once stood at a banquet table and told an entire room that I was a cautionary tale. I want to offer them exactly what I'd offer anyone else in this file, I said finally. A real shot at fixing it. The same shot I'd give a stranger. I paused. And then I want to see, with my own eyes, whether they take it. Here's the part one needs you to understand clearly, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not set out to destroy them. I set out to test them, with the exact same mercy Ren Capital extends to every distressed borrower in its portfolio, no more and no less, through our standard loss mitigation process. Paperwork generated under the company's name, never mine, reviewed by a loan servicer who had no idea whose parents he was corresponding with. My parents received a loan modification offer. Reduced payments for 6 months, arrears rolled into the back end of the loan, a real, workable bridge back to solvency. The same offer any qualifying homeowner in genuine hardship would receive. All they had to do was accept it, make the reduced payments on time, and demonstrate, over that 6-month window, that the household could sustain it. They had 90 days to respond before the file moved forward toward foreclosure. I checked the servicing notes every single week, the way you check a wound to see if it's healing. Week 3, no response. Week 6, a phone call finally from my mother's number to the servicer's general line, not to discuss the modification, but to ask, confused, why their longtime lender had suddenly changed its contact procedures. Week 9, 3 weeks before the deadline. The modification paperwork, finally signed and returned. I let myself, for about 4 days, feel something close to relief. Then came week 11, and the gossip that traveled back to me through the same small city grapevine that had told me everything else. Paige was relaunching the boutique a 3rd time, under a new name, with a can't-miss investor event at a rented event space downtown. Funded, according to the same second-hand source, by a chunk of the very bridge money my parents had freed up by deferring 6 months of mortgage payments. They hadn't used the relief to catch up. They'd used it to throw another party. I confirmed it through the servicing file 2 weeks later. The first reduced payment under the new modification had bounced. The second one never came at all. By week 14, the file moved, exactly the way every other defaulted file in that stack would have moved, into formal foreclosure proceedings. I didn't make that decision. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because it's the part of this story I hold on to the tightest. I gave them the same door every stranger in that file got. They were the only ones, out of 41 households, who walked straight past an open door, so they could throw a party in a rented hall instead. Foreclosure auctions are quiet, procedural things. Nothing like the dramatic gavel-pounding scenes you see in movies. A courthouse steps, a handful of bored bidders, a number called out, and a property changing hands in less time than it takes to order coffee. As the note holder, Ren Capital had the right to place a credit bid, to apply the value of the unpaid debt directly toward the purchase price instead of bidding fresh cash. The same mechanism any lender uses to recover collateral when a workout fails. No other bidders showed real interest in a property with that much deferred maintenance and that complicated a lien history. The gavel came down in under 2 minutes. I stood at the back of that small crowd of bidders in a blazer I'd bought with my own money, on a body that no longer flinched at being looked at, and I watched the auctioneer read out the winning bidder's name, Ren Capital LLC, to a half-empty courthouse plaza that had absolutely no idea what they'd just witnessed. I didn't go to the house that day. I waited 11 days. Long enough for the paperwork to fully clear, long enough that there could be no ambiguity, no argument, no version of events where this was anything other than exactly what it was. Then I drove there myself on a Tuesday morning, with the deed in a manila folder on the passenger seat, and I knocked on the door of the house I'd grown up in for the first time in 6 years. That's the porch. That's the moment I started this story with. My father in his robe, the eviction notice already in his hand. Not mine, the bank's standard pre-auction notice he'd apparently been ignoring for weeks, assuming, the way he'd assumed about most consequences his entire life, that it would simply resolve itself if he didn't look at it too closely. This is some kind of mistake, he said. It's not, I told him, the words coming out steadier than I expected. Check the name on the title transfer. It's been mine for 11 days. I watched my father's face do the math, slow and then all at once. The exact arithmetic of a man realizing that the daughter he'd spent 18 years calling a cautionary tale was now the legal owner of the roof over his head. "You did this," my mother said, appearing behind him, her voice climbing towards something between fury and panic. "You did this on purpose." "No," I said. "I gave you a modification. You missed it because Paige needed a party. I didn't take this house from you. I let that land for a second before I finished it. You just finally ran out of people willing to catch you. I'm not going to tell you the next part was simple, because revenge never is, even when it's earned." My parents had 30 days, by law, to vacate, with a cash-for-keys relocation offer. Ren capital extends to every household in that situation. A standard, modest sum to ease the move, the kind of mercy our company policy requires regardless of who sits on the other side of the paperwork. I made sure that offer reached them, exactly as it would have reached anyone else in that file. I did not, however, offer anything beyond it. No spare room, no bridge loan, no rescue. Paige's third relaunch collapsed within the month, vendor lawsuits finally catching up to a business that had been running on borrowed time and borrowed money for years. She and her husband moved in with his parents for a stretch, an arrangement I heard about, once again secondhand. My parents spent 11 days in a motel before a cousin offered them a converted garage apartment on a month-to-month basis. Not homeless in the way the title of this story makes it sound forever, but homeless in the specific, humbling, very real sense of having nowhere of their own to go, for the first time in their adult lives, while the daughter they'd called a failure signed the paperwork that put them there. My mother called me once, about 4 months later, not to apologize for the credit cards. She never once, in any conversation we've had since, acknowledged those existed. She called to ask, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard her use, whether I'd ever loved them, underneath everything. "I loved you for 18 years without one single piece of evidence that it was a good investment," I told her. "I don't know what to call what's left now, but it's not nothing. It's just not enough to fix this." Paige applied, 8 months later, for an entry-level marketing coordinator role at a firm, I'd learn afterward, that did contract work for several of Ren Capital's property listings. She didn't know, walking into that interview, whose company actually owned the building she was interviewing in. I never told the hiring manager to pass on her, and I never told him to make an exception for her either. She didn't get the job. I felt, hearing that, almost nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer to a question I'd been quietly asking myself for years about whether I'd ever fully let go of needing her approval. I didn't become my parents. That's the line I keep coming back to, the one that matters more to me than the deed, more than the auction, more than the porch. I built Ren Capital into something that now runs a financial literacy program for at-risk teenagers, specifically built around screen readers and alternative learning tools. Because I never want another 14-year-old sitting in a kitchen being told she's a failure when the actual problem is that nobody bothered to ask the right question. Marcus and I bought a house last spring. Modest, ours paid for with money I understand down to the last decimal, because for the first time in my life, every dollar in my name actually belongs to me. Talia helped us move in. Walter came to dinner the first weekend and raised a glass and told a story about the first time he ever heard me ask a question in his classroom, and said in front of everyone that he'd known that night I was going to be somebody who built things other people had given up on, including, eventually, herself. They called me the failure of the family for 18 years. They were right about exactly one thing. In the end, I really was the one in that family who never figured out how to walk past someone in trouble and do nothing about it. I just made sure, for once in my life, that the someone in trouble wasn't me. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to believe in you the most are the very ones who make you doubt yourself. They label you a failure, compare you to others, and make you feel like you'll never be enough. But your worth was never defined by their opinions. Life has a strange way of revealing the truth. The person they overlooked may become the one they admire. The child they called a disappointment may grow into someone extraordinary. Never let rejection convince you that you are worthless. Keep working, keep believing, keep becoming, because one day, your success won't just prove them wrong. It will prove to you that you were enough all along. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. And tell me in the comments, if you were Becky, would you have forgiven your family or taken everything they had?